Hey guys, tonight we squeeze through a hatch the size of your regrets and descend into the tight, metallic belly of a Cold War Soviet submarine. Imagine the scent of oil-soaked socks, a humid tinge of mildew, and the faint paranoia of being watched not just by your commander, but by the air itself. You're 200 meters under the sea now, sealed inside a floating tube of nationalism and questionable engineering. There's no sun, no seasons, and definitely no space to sulk. You probably won't survive this. The good news? You're alive. The bad news? So are 83 other exhausted, unshowered men who've all decided that deodorant is a capitalist lie. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to comment with your location and local time, because out here, time zones mean nothing and daylight is a myth. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You awaken in a cramped bunk, so narrow it feels like sleeping in a filing cabinet. Metal walls surround you. You bump your elbow, and it echoes with the cold resonance of Soviet steel. The lighting is dim and has two moods, harsh or broken. Pipes rattle over your head, condensation dripping rhythmically beside you. Like a leaky faucet timed to the Soviet anthem. You're on a submarine. Not just any sub, a 1970s-era Soviet nuclear-powered Leviathan with a strict sense of purpose and a complete absence of comfort. You don't choose to be here. You were probably drafted, because volunteering implies free will, which doesn't look good on state reports. You sit up, headbutting a pipe. Congratulations, you're now fully awake and mildly concussed. Your first breath is a cocktail of diesel fumes, canned food, and male despair. You cough, but try not to make it sound political. Even your phlegm is being monitored. A crewmate climbs over you literally. Bunks are stacked 3 high, with zero regard for personal dignity. Everyone sleeps in shifts. When you're not in your bed, someone else is. It's called hot bunking, which sounds oddly glamorous until you realize it means sharing sweat with a stranger whose hobbies include snoring and existential dread. You reach for your boots. They're damp, not from water, but from ambient moisture and whatever dreams were sweated out last night. You jam them on. Your uniform smells like every meal you've ever had on board, which is to say, vaguely fishy with a hint of bureaucratic shame. There's no such thing as private time, if you want to be alone. You have 2 options, the toilet occupied, or the torpedo bay ill-advised. You haven't seen the sky in weeks. The concept of sunburn feels fictional, like dragons or democracy. You stagger down the corridor correction, crawl space. You hunch, sidestep, twist around valves, duck under pipes, and whisper apologies to anyone trying to pass. This isn't walking, it's submarine yoga. One wrong move, and you headbutt a reactor panel. Again, there's always noise. Machinery, fans. Electrical hum, sometimes a clang that sounds like Poseidon knocking sarcastically. You never know what's normal. One guy swears the hiss near the reactor is fine. Another guy says it sounds different today. You decide it's best not to think about it. Thinking leads to worry, and worry leads to someone reporting you for lack of collective optimism. Down in the mess hall, 3 tables, bolted to the floor. With benches and elbows for armrests, you grab a metal tray. Breakfast awaits. It's gray. That's all you can say for certain. It has a shape. It might be porridge or cabbage mash, or repurposed engine grease with nutrients. Still, you eat it. Because food is fuel. And today you have 14 hours of crawling, lifting, pushing, and pretending you understand how sonar works. You eat quickly. If you eat slowly, you'll miss your turn at the single bathroom. And yes, it flushes. Sometimes, when Neptune's in a good mood, you hear a crewmate mutter a joke. Something about our luxurious mobile coffin. You don't laugh, not because it isn't funny, but because if you laugh, someone might think you're too cheerful. And cheerful men are either hiding something or about to break. Historians still argue whether Soviet submariners were selected for resilience or simply endurance. What's certain is that you've joined a club with one rule: survive the mission. And maybe, just maybe, you get to go above water again. You wake up to a sound that isn't quite a sound, more a vibration. A cold mechanical hum that's been drilling into your dreams since you boarded this underwater coffin. Congratulations, you've survived the night in a bunk no wider than your own body. The mattress is thinner than your patience. The pillow is stuffed with something that might be shredded insulation, and the air smells like boiled cabbage met wet sock, and decided to raise a family. You have approximately 3 inches of headspace, and the ceiling above you is metal. So, if you ever forget where you are, just bang your forehead on it and remember you're on a Soviet nuclear submarine during the Cold War, where luxury means not sharing your blanket with mold. Getting up is a gymnastics routine. First, try not to wake the guy an inch above you, who also didn't sleep, and who might retaliate with a well-placed boot. The corridor outside is just wide enough for one person to shuffle sideways. And by corridor, we mean pipe-laced tunnel, lined with machinery that wheezes like it's on its 5th divorce. Hygiene. The communal sink is a metal basin with water so cold it could file a complaint with human rights courts. Toothpaste is optional, as is soap. But if you're lucky, there's a cracked mirror to stare at while you wonder when exactly you stopped recognizing yourself. Some men don't even bother with daily washing, not because they're lazy, but because the concept of fresh has long since surrendered to the moist metallic fog of submarine life. Breakfast is a grayish mystery slop, served from a dented ladle. It smells like porridge, but tastes like defeat. Some kind of fish paste might be lurking underneath, and if there's a single tomato slice, that's a festival. Coffee only in your dreams. What you get is a grainy brew called sickery that tastes like someone boiled socks and optimism. Your bunkmates don't speak much. Not because they don't like you, though, maybe, but because there's a general rule: silence is easier than complaining, which accomplishes nothing. The radio plays quietly some patriotic tune, sung with more loyalty than rhythm, and the captain's voice occasionally crackles through the PA system, like God interrupting your thoughts, reminding everyone to maintain discipline and check the oxygen levels. Because yes, oxygen isn't a guarantee, it's a variable. Historians still argue whether Soviet subcrews genuinely believed in the superiority of their mission, or whether they simply endured it the way you endure a dental appointment with clenched teeth and silent panic. What's certain is that many sailors went weeks without seeing sunlight, navigating by sonar and faith. One quirky tidbit: sailors sometimes slept with their shoes on, not because of cold, but because if the sub flooded or caught fire, you had 3 seconds to run, and no one wanted to die barefoot. That's how real the fear was. Your bed was not just a place to rest, it was an escape hatch in training. So as you finish your meager breakfast and contemplate another 18 hours of recycled air, engine noise, and quiet existential dread, just remember, this was the proud machinery of global nuclear deterrence. And somehow, it always smelled faintly of herring. You shuffle toward the latrine. Not walk shuffle, because walking implies space, freedom, maybe a fresh breeze. But here, inside this torpedo-shaped sauna of sweat and secrets, there's only sideways gliding and breath holding. And now comes the part that makes even hardened officers flinch using the submarine toilet. The Soviet Navy, in its infinite generosity, provided one toilet for 25 to 30 men. You read that right. A single throne, bolted onto a rusty pipe maze, protected by a dented metal door that doesn't close so much as wheeze shut, like it's tired of your nonsense. And the toilet paper, no such decadence. If you're lucky, you'll get a strip of newspaper. If you're unlucky, it's already been used for reading or worse. You sit if you're brave and suddenly understand the ancient fear of falling into the abyss. The flush system is a button that makes a noise like a dying walrus, and half the time does nothing at all. Occasionally, it backfires. Yes, backfires. There are horror stories about sailors who pressed the wrong valve and unleashed a fountain that only added insult to indignity. It's not just bathroom shame, it's bathroom roulette. So, you learn quickly, go fast, go quiet, and for the love of Lenin, check the plumbing diagram first. And remember your shoes. There's always water on the floor. At least, you hope it's water. Historians still argue whether these grim hygiene conditions were a deliberate part of psychological discipline or simply the result of limited design priorities. After all, submarines were built for war, not wellness, and compared to death by torpedo. A little splashback is just an extra insult in your Cold War adventure. But the horror doesn't end there. If someone's using the facilities, you wait, sometimes for 40 minutes. The corridor becomes a conga line of despair, each man rocking on his heels, pretending not to hear the plumbing groan like a Soviet symphony. Eye contact forbidden, smiling arrestable offense. One quirky innovation, some sailors, fed up with the bottleneck, repurposed used tin cans, labeled them with polite euphemisms, hid them under bunks. You don't look too closely under the beds anymore, do you? The air smells complex. A cocktail of diesel, mildew, unwashed uniforms, boiled cabbage, and resignation. Deodorant doesn't exist. Showers, scheduled once a week if the water supply isn't being rationed for coolant. And even then, it's less of a cleansing ritual and more of a moist disappointment under a trickle of lukewarm regret. You begin to realize that privacy is extinct. Every bodily function is public domain. Sneezing gets a nod. Snoring is just background ambiance. And if someone farts, that's practically music. At least it confirms someone's digestive tract still works. By the end of day 3, you've given up shame. You squat, splash, and scoot with the stoic grace of a man who has stared into the abyss and flushed anyway. You're no longer a civilian. You're submarine material. Welcome to the lowest deck of the Cold War. You're hungry, which is unfortunate, because it's mealtime. In a place where sunlight doesn't exist, and your last memory of weather involved snow, food should be a small comfort, a morale booster, a warm hug in bowl form. Instead, it's Soviet naval cuisine designed more for fuel than flavor. You slide into the galley, which is basically a narrow hallway with pots, steam, and a cook who hasn't smiled since Khrushchev. Today's delicacy, cabbage soup. Again, the scent is aggressive. A murky liquid with floating strands that could be vegetable or disintegrated cardboard. Beside it sits a slice of black bread that's more brick than food, capable of denting steel if thrown. It's stale. It always is. You soak it in the soup, not to improve the flavor, but so your teeth have a fighting chance. Some days, you're gifted with kasha, boiled buckwheat, mush that tastes like it already gave up. On special occasions, a can of sprats in oil makes the rounds. And you'd think you were dining on sturgeon caviar the way sailors react. A spoonful of jam, that's luxury. A cube of sugar, that's currency. Your stainless steel tray clatters with all the elegance of a prison line. You sit shoulder to shoulder with men you've barely spoken to, bonded by shared steam and silent chewing. Conversation is minimal, partly because the engine noise is deafening, but mostly because there's nothing new to say. No one's going to ask. So, what'd you get up to today? Because the answer is always torpedo drills, scrubbing bulkheads, and wondering whether that smell is electrical fire or just Boris's boots again. One historical fact that's oddly charming: Soviet submarines often carried crates of potatoes stored under the floorboards. They were considered essential versatile, filling, and able to survive deep sea pressures better than most officers. You begin to love the potato in all its forms, boiled, mashed, slightly green, and even raw. And yet, despite the monotony, food remains sacred. Meals are timed like religious rituals. Missing one is social suicide. People have shouted over the last piece of pickled herring. Some have bartered cigarettes for another scoop of kasha. Others hoard packets of tea like war loot. Historians still argue whether Soviet submarine menus were intentionally bland to keep discipline sharp or simply reflected the logistical nightmare of feeding 80 men underwater for months. Either way, your taste buds have gone into hibernation, and your dreams now include vivid fantasies of mayonnaise. A quirky detail on longer missions. The cook might bake bread directly on top of the diesel engine, yes. Engine-baked bread. It sounds artisanal until you smell it, a delightful blend of warm yeast and motor oil. Bon appetit. Still, every so often, a rumor spreads like gospel. The captain received a package. There's a can of fruit, or even whispers canned meat. You perk up, you wait, and then it's served to the officers while you return to your cabbage water with the resigned dignity of a man who's forgotten the concept of seasoning. You don't eat to enjoy. You eat to not collapse. And you chew each bite like it might be your last. Or worse, your next. Clothes. Let's talk about your uniform, if you can call it that, without making the word uniform feel insulted. It begins with wool, scratchy, thick, and proudly defiant of comfort. Wool socks, wool pants, wool shirt, wool undershirt, wool cap. The Soviet Navy had a rule if it could be made from wool. It should be. Not because it breathes well or feels nice. No. Because it survives mildew better. And mildew, in this floating steel sweatbox, is your constant roommate. Your boots are rubber, technically waterproof. Though waterproof doesn't mean they won't trap gallons of your own foot sweat like two portable swamp terrariums. You try not to remove them unless absolutely necessary, not out of discipline. But mercy for others. You change clothes roughly once a week, depending on rotation. Laundry. Don't be ridiculous. There is no laundry. There's no washing machine, no spare water, and no such thing as fresh. If your clothes start developing personalities of their own, you hang them in the engine room overnight, where the heat roasts some of the bacterial life into oblivion. The rest evolves. A mainstream fact, Soviet subs didn't carry many spare uniforms. Each sailor was issued a single set of formal dress for emergencies, but wore the same work gear every day. And since the air was humid and uncirculated, mildew and rot set in faster than hope. Now here's the fun bit, Lice. Oh yes. True mascots of the Soviet fleet. They arrived early and stayed loyal. You scratch constantly. Behind your neck, your armpits, your waistband. You develop a talent for itching with elegance, casual, rhythmic, almost musical. Historians still argue whether the lice problem was ever fully addressed. Some say the crews were deloused chemically before boarding. Others argue that was just for parade units. Either way, you and your bunkmate have a silent agreement not to talk about what's crawling under your collars. One fringe tidbit. There was a rumor unverified. Of course, that some sailors started giving names to the larger lice, like pets. This is Mikhail. He's been with me since Murmansk. Hygiene becomes abstract. You wipe your face with your sleeve, blow your nose into a scrap of toilet paper if you're lucky, and maybe rinse your hands in lukewarm tea if no one's looking. You do not shower, because you can't. There is no real shower. There is a small hose. It sprays suspiciously yellow-tinted water. You avoid it. Every few weeks when conditions allow. There might be a hygiene hour, an event so sacred it could be mistaken for Christmas. Men strip to their underwear, wipe themselves down with vinegar-dipped rags, and try not to shiver from the freezing draft that sneaks through the ventilation. Still, you soldier on. You learn to embrace the itchy, to make peace with the smell, to bond over whose armpits have achieved sentience. You stop dreaming of clean t-shirts. You dream of one pair of socks that don't stand up on their own. Now let's smile through clenched teeth and talk about the food, or as the crew calls it, fuel, which is a charming euphemism for reheated beige sadness. You start your day, if you can call it that, in a submarine without sunlight, with a metal tray slapped onto it, a slice of rye bread so dense it could be used in medieval catapults, one boiled egg, maybe a dollop of cache of buckwheat, porridge sticky, grayish, and just as edible cold as it is hot, which is lucky because it's always cold. No one eats for pleasure here. You eat because your stomach filed a noise complaint. The food is functional, high in starch, low in variety, and prepared in a kitchen the size of your closet back home, if your closet also had 40-degree C steam, vibrating floors, and one furious cook yelling about overcooked potatoes. Meat. Technically, yes, sometimes. Usually in the form of canned mystery chunks preserved in brine. They call it tushanka, a word that sounds vaguely threatening, and appropriately so. It comes in tins, opened with a bayonet, and smells like commitment. You don't ask what animal it came from. You don't want to know. Fish appears, too. But this isn't fresh catch. It's salted herring, vacuumed of joy and flavor. It arrives on your plate curled like it's trying to escape the shame of being served. Historians still argue whether the Soviet Navy's nutrition plan was intentionally bland to preserve mental discipline or just the result of brutal logistical limits. Either way, it works. You don't have the energy to mutiny if you're too constipated to move. Speaking of, that fiber isn't exactly on the menu. You chew dry biscuits that suck moisture out of your soul. You drink black tea so strong it could be mistaken for melted shoelaces. Milk only in powdered form. Fruit only if someone smuggled it aboard. Vegetables boiled to oblivion. A mainstream historical fact, Soviet submarines did carry a dietitian-approved mix of proteins, fats, and carbs. But due to poor storage and lack of refrigeration, most fresh items spoiled within days of departure. After that, it was the realm of cans, jars, and hope, a fringe tidbit once, during a 1970s patrol in the Pacific. One submarine reported that its onions began sprouting. The crew celebrated. It was the only fresh thing they'd seen in weeks. They named the sprouts. They gave them ranks. Still hungry. Great because dinner might be cabbage soup or barley gruel. Sometimes, if it's a holiday, you get sausage. Technically, you bite into it and wonder if it's even meat or just compressed regrets. Dessert. There's a rumor of candy. It's rare. One hard candy, doled out like treasure. Sailors trade them like prison cigarettes. Some keep them as reminders of land. Others dissolve them slowly on their tongues, while staring into the flickering red emergency lights like they're reliving their childhood. There are no menus, no choices. You don't order meals. Meals just happen, like storms or existential crises. But you eat anyway, because the alternative is listening to your stomach groan in Morse code. And besides, chewing gives you something to do between sonar pings and quiet panic. And now, dear listener, you work, because on this floating steel coffin, idleness is a luxury reserved for the dead. Everyone else busy keeping the metal beast alive, from bow to stern, day and well, simulated day. You trudge down the narrow corridor, back aching from your hammock bed marathon, and step into the engine room, a place where heat, noise, and hopelessness all go to socialize. The air is thick, humid, and carries a metallic scent that reminds you vaguely of burnt soup and despair. Your clothes stick to your back. Your boots slosh in something that may or may not be water. You don't ask. If you're lucky, your job involves pushing buttons and pretending to understand what blinking lights mean. If you're less lucky, You're twisting valves, scrubbing filters, or hauling 60-kilo shells like it's medieval CrossFit. Either way, your shift lasts 6 hours, then 6 hours of sleep, then 6 hours of free time that somehow includes mandatory exercises, inspections, and more scrubbing. Hard labor, absolutely. Soviet submariners weren't exactly sipping cocktails in leather chairs. Maintenance never ends. There's rust to sand, pipes to fix, wires to reroute, and panels to inspect. And when something breaks, which it does, you fix it now. Not after lunch. Not tomorrow. Now. Or the entire vessel starts doing impressions of a depth charge. Women were rarely part of Cold War submarine crews, though some historians argue whether there were covert exceptions, emergency medics, radio specialists. But for the men on board, the labor was relentless, gender neutral, only in its cruelty. You all sweat the same. Want a break? You can't leave. There's no horizon, no open door, just claustrophobic tunnels and the hum of the nuclear reactor. Your angry, radioactive roommate. You miss the concept of outside. You dream of weather, even bad weather. You start to romanticize the idea of a cold rain on your face, until a pipe leaks and grants your wish in the form of machine oil drizzle, the fringe tidbit on one famous sub. The crew's morale plummeted so hard during a particularly long patrol that an officer invented a game where everyone drew stick figures on condensation and made up soap opera plots about them. It was wildly successful, until someone drew Stalin and got put on bathroom detail. Discipline is strict. You salute. You report. You don't complain. Well, you do, but quietly. Because the guy you insult today might be the guy in charge of emergency ballast valves tomorrow. And teamwork matters. If you fall asleep on your job, the entire sub might fall asleep permanently on the ocean floor. Remember, this is labor without weekends. No Sunday pancakes. No, thank God it's Friday. Just metal, sweat, and tasks. Work is your anchor to sanity, or what's left of it. And yet, there's a strange pride. This sub might be smelly, creaky, and designed by someone who hated joy, but it floats. It functions. And part of that is because of you. You're a rust-covered cog in a leaking machine, and that's the highest compliment you'll get today. Heat. Relentless. Inescapable. And oddly personal, like an unwanted hug that lasts for months. You'd think underwater equals cool and breezy. But no. Soviet submarines specialize in trapping every possible degree of warmth and multiplying it by a factor of body odor and reactor fumes. Welcome to the climate of despair. The temperature in some compartments regularly hits 40°C. That's 104°F. For the Celsius challenge, not outside, inside, with no sunlight. You sweat in your sleep. You sweat while eating. You sweat just by thinking too hard. And because you're sharing this sauna with 100 other men, your sweat makes friends, forming a sort of communal soup in the air. No spoon necessary. Now imagine winter. Oh, you thought it gets cold cute. The heating system works until it doesn't. Certain compartments suddenly feel like the moon's dark side. Pipes freeze. Condensation turns into mini icicles. One foot feels like it's in a Turkish bath, the other in a Siberian ditch. The thermostat. That's just a colorful wall sticker. You try to adapt. You sleep wrapped in thin military blankets that might have been designed by sadists. Your uniform is not weather sensitive. It's standard issue and eternally damp. Some sailors sew extra layers into their undershirts with thread from medical kits. Unofficial submarine fashion week. Still itchy. Still smells like feet. Fans help a little with summer heat if they work. And by fans, we mean wheezing metal boxes that blow air only after you personally threaten them with a wrench. In winter, sailors have been known to gather around machinery, not for love of engineering, but because it radiates something resembling warmth. You'd hug a toaster if you could find one. Now, let's talk sweat rations. That's right, sweating too much dehydrates you, and water's limited. Historians still argue whether rationing water during heat waves was strategic or sadistic. You'd love a cold drink. Instead, you get lukewarm tea and orders to pace your hydration. You dream of ice cubes like they're precious stones. Your bunk becomes a biosphere. In summer, you stick to it like glue. In winter, it chills you like a metal gurney. If you sleep on the bottom level, you get dust. If you're on the top, you get condensation drips fondly referred to as ceiling kisses. The middle prime real estate. If you bribe the right guy. One quirky fact, some sailors kept onions in their bunks. Why? Supposedly to absorb bad air and reduce illness. Did it work? Probably not. But at least you could blame the smell on something other than Yuri's socks. Weather inside is worse than outside because it's constant. You never see the sun, never feel a breeze. Your body forgets what seasons feel like. Sometimes a pipe bursts just to remind you of temperature by dousing you with Arctic coolant. Fun, yet somehow you survive. You adapt. You laugh at jokes about roasting alive and freezing to death sometimes in the same room. You learn to live with the submarine's moods, sweating and shivering like a synchronized misery dance. Water. You'd think being surrounded by it, beneath it, beside it, above and below it might actually be useful. But here's the cruel twist: you're drowning in water you can't drink. Welcome to the great irony of Soviet submarine life, where hydration is a gamble and thirst is just part of the vibe. Fresh water is rationed tighter than vodka at a nun's picnic. There's a tank, yes, but it's limited and must be carefully allocated for drinking, cooking, and cleaning, which means drinking usually loses. You sip tepid liquid out of dented metal cups, pretending it's refreshing. Spoiler, it isn't. It tastes like aluminum and boiled pipe dreams. You can't just open a tap and hope for the best. The water that does come out is usually desalinated from ocean intake by systems so old they groan louder than the crew. Historians still argue whether these filtration systems actually filtered anything or just played a sound, so you'd feel better about drinking recycled bathwater. Bathing a fantasy. Showers exist in theory, just like personal space and good moods. In practice, sailors might get one proper rinse per week. If lucky, you queue like it's a concert. You scrub with soap that could be repurposed as engine grease. And the water pressure is about the same as being licked by a tired cat. So, instead, most sailors resort to the classic sailor's wipe down, a damp rag, a prayer, and an optimistic attitude. Feet first, then armpits, and maybe your neck. Full body hygiene. Save it for shore leave, if you ever make it back. And don't get romantic about laundry either. Washing your uniform is like solving a puzzle blindfolded. There's no washer, no dryer, just a bucket, a prayer, and hot water if it's available. Which it isn't. Clothes are often rinsed in whatever water's left over from other chores. So yes, that clean shirt might smell suspiciously like soup. Quirky tidbit time, some sailors tried to make cologne from herbs smuggled aboard and stored in vodka. The goal was to freshen up. The result was a perfume so pungent it could probably deter NATO sonar. Drinking too much? Also bad. Overhydration means more bathroom visits, and the submarine lavatories are no luxury. Remember, you're sharing with everyone. You must hold your breath, your dignity, and your balance. The pipes gurgle like they're judging you. And there's always the haunting fear of a clog mid-patrol. To make it worse, you have to balance hydration with salt intake. Too little water, dehydration. Too much dilutes the salt your body sweats out in the 40 to AGC hotbox of your sleeping quarters. No one explains the exact math, but you're expected to just figure it out. Sailor science: drink only when you're either dying or hallucinating. By the end of your shift, your tongue feels like cardboard. Your breath could fog a mirror in 10 seconds. and you're still rationing sips like they're gold. You fantasize about lakes, showers, ice cubes, rainstorms. Even a run through a sprinkler sounds like paradise. Just anything wet that doesn't smell like cabbage. But water, the most basic human necessity, becomes both your captor and your savior. It's there, but never yours. It sustains you barely. It teases you with its abundance while remaining untouchable. That's the Cold War submarine paradox submerged in the sea, yet thirstier than a camel in July. Now, as the metal doors of the sub seal one last time in your memory, you let your breath slow. The creak of pipes, the wheeze of stale air, the shuffle of heavy boots all fade into a soft, fading echo. That endless hum of the nuclear core, the heartbeat of your floating tomb, becomes almost a lullaby now. You're no longer sweating or freezing. You're floating in the quiet. Your bunk, though damp and cramped, now feels like a cocoon. The walls around you, once menacing steel, are now just shadows whispering their last secrets. Even the flicker of the overhead bulb seems to dim just for you. This voyage through heat, hunger, metal, and madness is ending. The ocean holds you in silence. And in this moment, you are still, not fighting, not sweating, just breathing. So let your eyelids grow heavy. Let the engine's last hum rock you gently to sleep. And remember, you survived what most never dared to imagine. Now, we drift into a place that smells faintly of rosewater, shellfish, and political tension. You're blinking awake in a bed that costs more than your childhood home. In a palace where people starve artistically. In Versailles, the servants have already wafted in lace rustles. Wigs hover, and somewhere, a footman is deciding whether to risk telling you breakfast is late. In Edo, you rise to the sound of wooden sandals clacking politely down a hallway. The faint whiff of pickled daikon trailing behind them like a polite insult. Your morning hasn't started yet, but someone is already judging the way you hold your rice bowl. You would never think that people with unlimited wealth and access to luxury would spend their mornings nibbling on yesterday's pigeon pie while performing silent operas of status. But that's the fun part. Nobility didn't just eat. They displayed eating. They choreographed appetite. They turned hunger into theater and digestion into diplomacy. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, post your location and local time below, because if I'm losing sleep writing this, you might as well share where you're nodding off from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stretch your limbs. The bed canopy above you is embroidered with scenes of Greek gods, doing things no one in Versailles actually believes in. But it's beautiful. You are hungry, but there's no rushing breakfast when you live at court. Someone else has to decide it's time for you to eat. And in the meantime, there's gossip to overhear, a cravat to be fluffed, and the morning breeze to assess for its emotional intentions. In Edo, your wooden house creaks gently. You're a daimyo, or at least pretending to be one. And your morning begins with kneeling beside a tray of tiny bowls. There's fermented soybean paste that smells like ambition, dried fish that crunches like regret, and pickled plums that wage war on your gums. You eat in near silence, unless someone outranks you, in which case you pause every time they sneeze. If they nod, you nod. If they don't eat, you just admire your food until it's cold and metaphorical. Back in Versailles, Your breakfast is technically impressive, but spiritually confusing. A cold meat pie, slices of quince jelly, stale bread shaped like a bird, and if you're lucky, something pretending to be coffee. There is no cereal. There is no toast. There is no understanding of digestion as we know it. You eat to display civility, not to survive. Hunger is not fashionable. Appetite is to be hinted at, like a lover or a revolution. It is, frankly, exhausting. And if you think you're going to eat what you like, think again. Your preferences do not matter. You are a cog in a culinary machine that is designed to function without joy. Some historians still argue whether the nobles of Versailles actually enjoyed their food or simply endured it while trying not to lose their wigs in public. Meanwhile, Edo's breakfast dishes include grilled sea bream, lotus root with vinegar, and a soup that contains both seaweed and mystery. A traveling European once described it as polite ocean water with ambition. Your host watches your reaction closely. If you slurp too loudly, you're a barbarian; too softly, and you're a fraud. Historians debate whether Edo nobles cared about taste or just feared dishonoring their ancestors by underchewing. Either way, your morning is off to a passive-aggressive start, but congratulations. You've survived the first meal of the day, which is mostly a test in composure, balance, and not vomiting delicately scented broth on a silk kimono. You are now ready for the second most stressful part of your day dressing. You'd think that getting dressed in the morning would be the easy part, but in Versailles, nothing is easy, not even sleeves. You stand there, arms slightly raised like a surrendering bird, while 3 people dress you in fabric that was once more expensive than war. One servant adjusts your shirt cuffs. Another fluffs your cravat with such precision that it qualifies as a small architectural achievement. The third debates whether your overcoat should whisper, "I'm powerful," or scream, "I haven't eaten solid food." In 2 days, this is not a private moment. No, dressing at Versailles is a spectator sport. If you're important, people gather to watch. Literally, it's called the lever, or rising, and it's part ceremony, part fashion show, part political audition. If you're lucky, someone important watches you put on pants and thinks that man understands brocade. Historians still argue whether these rituals were genuinely necessary or just elaborate ways to waste time while pretending not to scheme. Meanwhile, across the world, in Edo, Japan, you're folding yourself into 5 layers of silk and trying not to sneeze. Your kimono must match the season, your mood, and possibly the moon cycle. You tie your obi, a belt that could double as a folding chair, with the precision of a monk folding paper cranes. You do not rush. Rushing implies chaos, and chaos implies you might be poor. And poor is a dangerous look when you're pretending that breakfast fish bones haven't punctured your self-esteem. You are now fully dressed, but emotionally drained. Versailles fashion is heavy, literally. Your wig weighs more than a newborn, and the heels you're wearing are designed by someone who hated feet. But they make you taller, which makes you more noble, which makes you more likely to be allowed in the next room, where someone might finally feed you a hot grape. In Edo, your outfit says I am both invisible and important. Everything must be precise. If your kimono flaps the wrong way, people will whisper, and in court, whispers are more lethal than swords. Scholars still debate whether Edo nobles genuinely enjoyed the aesthetic rigors of court attire, or just accepted it like a splinter in the soul, annoying but essential. Oh, and don't forget the fan. In both cultures, Fans are more than fans. They are props, metaphors, weapons, and occasionally very effective ways to hide boredom. You snap yours open with calculated grace. In Versailles, it's covered in painted cherubs with questionable expressions. In Edo, it's made of rice paper and dignity. Either way, you now look exactly like someone who's about to attend a meal where no one eats and everyone judges. And speaking of that meal, let's talk about lunch. Because if you thought breakfast was an exercise in humiliation, lunch is where the social chess game turns into a full contact sport. There will be hierarchy. There will be orchestration. There will be spoons made of gold and expectations forged in centuries of passive-aggressive traditions. But first, you have to walk there, carefully, while balancing 20 pounds of cloth, a mountain of social pressure, and the sudden realization that you haven't actually smiled in 3 days. Lunch should be simple. You sit, you eat, you smile politely. Not in Versailles. In Versailles, lunch is choreography. You don't just walk into a room and take a seat. You are escorted publicly into the grand dining hall, where even the wallpaper is judging you. And once you arrive, you don't get to sit anywhere you like. Seating is based on rank, lineage, and how convincingly you can pretend your powdered face doesn't itch. Here's the catch you're probably not eating. The king is. Everyone else is watching. The grand couvert, the great public meal, turns Louis XIV's lunch into a spectator event. Like a royal mukbang, minus the chewing sounds. You, along with dozens of courtiers, stand respectfully as His Majesty calmly spoons consommé into his royal mouth. You bow when he sneezes. You flinch when he coughs. You try not to blink too loud. The meal itself is a feast. If you're the king, dozens of dishes appear, many too elaborate to pronounce, let alone digest. There are pigeons in pastry, swans stuffed with smaller birds, and artichokes served with the kind of ceremony usually reserved for funerals. Historians still argue whether Louis actually liked these foods, or if the court just collectively decided that roasted peacock was the universal love language of power. Meanwhile, in Edo, Japan, lunch involves more silence, more precision, and definitely less peacock. You kneel at a low table, your knees already plotting revenge, and begin a meal structured by season, status, and centuries of culinary etiquette. The rice must be white, the pickles must be sour, and the miso must be just shy of boiling, like your repressed emotions. Serving food is a dance. The host bows. You bow deeper. They offer the tray. You hesitate just long enough to show restraint. You accept. Then everyone bows again. Chopsticks aren't just tools. They are mood indicators. Hold them too tightly, and you look aggressive. Too loosely, and you're careless. Snap them apart too fast, and the spirits might think you're summoning them for a duel. You would never think that a fishbone could spark an existential crisis. But here you are quietly nibbling grilled Thai while wondering whether your silent chewing sounds desperate. The food is art, literally. Edo cuisine is plated like a watercolor painting. Colors must harmonize. Textures must whisper, and garnishes must not overshadow the daikon. Historians still argue whether these meals were more about nourishment or performance. But let's be honest, if your meal comes with a scroll explaining its emotional journey, you're not just eating, you're curating. Back in Versailles, the audience shifts. The king finishes his main course. A subtle nod, and voila, desserts appear like a pastel army. Candied fruit, tarts, creams, and spun sugar shaped like betrayal. You dare not take a bite unless explicitly invited. Sometimes, a noble might get to sip broth. A tiny victory. More often, you stand there awkwardly smiling, while your stomach composes a tragic opera. And oh, the napkins. In Versailles, they are folded into birds, crowns, or scenes from mythology. In Edo, they're folded like quiet prayers. Both serve the same purpose, keeping appearances tidy, while everyone silently contemplates mortality and digestive dignity. Lunch ends, not with applause, but with a bow, a nod, and a slow retreat backward. Like you're leaving the presence of a sleeping bear. Your stomach growls, your knees ache, but you've survived another performance. Only 6 more hours until dinner. You might think dinner is where you finally relax, sink into a chair, and casually tuck into a plate of something warm. But this is Versailles and Edo, Japan we're talking about, not your neighborhood bistro. In both courts, dinner is war fought not with swords, but with etiquette, posture, and an existential dread of soup. In Versailles, dinner doesn't start until the king says it does. Not even a whisper of a bread roll before then. You might already be dressed in layers of brocade and perfume. Your stomach long since filed a complaint with human resources. But patience is your only course until the first silver tray is uncovered. If you're lucky, and we mean really lucky, you'll get to sit. If not, you hover nearby in stiff admiration, pretending your knees aren't auditioning for a horror film. The food, enormous. Roasted everything. Pheasants wearing their own feathers like fashion accessories. Fish presented in gelatinous domes that wobble with every political tension in the room. And sauces. So many sauces. Some white, some green, some entirely questionable. Historians still argue whether these sauces were meant to complement the meat or just showcase the chef's ability to conjure dairy into shapes. The strange part, you don't get to pick what you eat. You are served whatever dish arrives in your direction, and you don't dare ask questions like, "What is this jelly cube doing next to my swan wing?" You just nod and chew, preferably silently, gracefully, and at half the speed your stomach demands. Over in Edo, Japan, the tone is quieter, but no less intense. The kaiseki dinner, considered the height of noble Japanese cuisine, is not just a meal, but a ritual. You don't just eat courses, you journey through them. It's a culinary pilgrimage with 10 tiny stops and no shortcuts. First comes the appetizer, then soup, then sashimi, then a simmered dish, a grilled dish, a vinegared thing, and finally, something grilled or fried again, because repetition is sacred when it's beautiful. Portion sizes impossibly small. You'll spend more energy bowing for the next dish than you will digesting the one before, and that's intentional. Kaiseki isn't designed to fill your belly. It's designed to fill your soul with peace, your eyes with symmetry, and your dinner napkin with fear of doing something rude. One misplaced chopstick, one stray droplet of soy sauce, and you're the uncultured barbarian who just dishonored a carrot. The conversation is hushed. The room smells faintly of cedar, miso, and subtle judgment. In Versailles, dinner is spectacle. In Edo, it's sacred theater. In both, you are not the star. You are the understudy in a costume 2 sizes too tight, hoping not to trip during the opening act. The fork makes its awkward debut in Versailles during this period. slowly replacing knives for those dainty bites of scandalous asparagus tips. Over in Japan, no forks, just your two sticks of destiny. Historians still argue whether chopsticks make food more artistic or just keep you too busy to complain. Either way, you won't finish your rice until your wrist has developed its own survival instinct. Dessert follows, of course, in France. Sugar reigns supreme. Marzipan castles, meringue birds, crystallized violets, all decorative, most barely edible. In Japan, dessert is red bean paste shaped into a flower, or mochi, or a single seasonal fruit, served like a farewell sonnet. One melon, half a cantaloupe, and your host just declared financial war. At last, the final bow. In Edo, you lower yourself until your forehead nearly kisses the tatami mat. In Versailles, you offer a graceful nod, your mouth pursed in the universal expression of "I just survived a 17-course political negotiation." Dinner is over, but the anxiety lingers like a perfectly plated mushroom, beautiful, mysterious, and possibly poisonous. You glance around the room and realize the meal isn't over, it's merely changing tempo. At Versailles, the king's dinner is a performance of glacial pace and extravagant choreography, known as the Grand Couvre. The public meal is exactly what it sounds like: a private dinner eaten publicly, in front of an audience who may or may not be invited. You don't talk to the king. You don't eat with him. You just sit there in semi-awe, watching a man chew duck. In theory, this should be awkward. In practice, it's a social sport. The king dines while you hover behind velvet ropes, pretending not to notice him while intensely noticing him. His napkin is more expensive than your monthly income. Every dish paraded in is announced, inspected, and occasionally sniffed before landing on his gold-rimmed plate. If he doesn't touch something, it's not wasted. Lucky nobles scramble to finish the leftovers. It's royal composting, but with foie gras. Meanwhile, over in Edo, period Japan, the dining ritual dances to an entirely different rhythm. The kaiseki meal is served in courses so delicate and precise, you feel like apologizing before eating. Every item is served in its own specific bowl or tray. You hold your chopsticks like you're defusing a bomb. And yes, there's a correct way to angle your soup bowl so the fish stares at you from the left side, not the right, never the right. Here, silence isn't awkward, it's expected. Talking during a high-status meal is like using a megaphone in a library. You chew softly. You place your dishes back in exact position. And heaven forbid you tip the lacquer tray, because lacquerware isn't just fragile. It's sacred, crafted over months, with layers of sap that can outlast empires. It's the porcelain of patience. Back in Versailles, it's anything but quiet. People cough, whisper, elbow each other. Some try to fake an opinion about the king's mutton. Others just eye the silverware, wondering what they could pawn for a new wig. Historians still argue whether the Grand Couvert was an honest attempt at transparency or just another vanity fair. What's certain is this: Versailles meals are theater. Even the servers are dressed in formal livery, and entire job titles exist just for holding a candlestick. In Edo, Japan, the meal is a ritual. In Versailles, it's a spotlight. In one, you consume the meal. In the other, the meal consumes you. But both, in their own gilded way, are exhausting. You came for food. You stayed for politics, etiquette, and minor wrist injuries from holding the wrong cup. You're not sure if you're full or just emotionally bloated. But don't worry, Dessert is coming, and so is a new set of rules. You would think that after surviving dinner with your dignity intact, dessert would be a reward. Not quite. In Versailles and Edo, Japan, dessert wasn't just sugar, it was diplomacy, decorum, and sometimes a thinly veiled performance of national identity. You're not here for a casual slice of cake. You're here to understand the cosmos through custard. At Versailles, the final courses could last longer than an entire modern brunch. A parade of sweets, jellies, candied fruits, marzipan sculptures, and spun sugar displays marched past your aching eyes, each more intricate than the last. One table centerpiece famously featured a working mechanical fountain that sprayed rose water over sugared almonds. You'd think that would be the highlight, but no. Nobles judged each other on whether they could eat politely while being lightly misted by a dessert geyser. Because why not? Historians still argue whether these elaborate finales were more about showing off French agricultural prowess or masking the fact that the main courses were often cold and overcooked. But sugar was king. It was expensive, imported, and served not for pleasure, but for status. You might not have teeth anymore, but you had candied violets shaped like cherubs. Totally worth the dental collapse. Meanwhile, dessert in Edo, Japan was a bit less explosive. Subtlety ruled. A noble might end a meal with seasonal wagashi, delicate confections shaped like maple leaves or cherry blossoms, often containing bean paste that tastes better than it sounds. But don't expect chocolate lava cake. That hadn't been invented yet. Also, fire in the dining room considered impolite. Instead, a sweet served in the Edo court was more like a short poem, fleeting, balanced, and deeply symbolic. Some desserts had names like moonlight reflected on a rippled pond. Others resembled miniature gardens, complete with edible pebbles. You'd need a calligraphy scroll just to describe what you were eating. And remember, it's best to finish it in exactly 3 bites. Anything more is gluttony. Anything less is waste. Back in Versailles, dessert wasn't eaten so much as consumed by the eyes. Entire rooms were built just to display sugar sculptures of classical ruins or pastoral scenes, then left untouched because ants exist. Even in palaces, chefs competed to outdo each other in visual grandeur, with one documented sugar tableau stretching nearly 12 feet across. People applauded the pastry like it was a military victory. You, of course, are expected to show restraint. Don't smile too much. Happiness is for peasants. Don't eat too quickly. Greed is gauche. And absolutely do not ask for seconds. The good news? You're unlikely to be full, so you won't need a nap. The bad news? You'll still be digesting the social pressure well past midnight. By now, you're not just tired. You're dining jet-lagged culturally and digestively. But the party isn't over yet, in both Versailles and Edo, Japan. Post-meal rituals weren't about comfort. They were about enduring one last gauntlet of status games, etiquette traps, and the unspoken sport of not falling over in your silk slippers. At Versailles, the meal didn't end. It dissolved into a lingering haze of opera, card games, or awkward musical recitals. After the 5th course, you'd think everyone would scatter to their rooms like overfed pigeons. But no. Nobles loitered in salons, fanning themselves dramatically while pretending not to be bored. You're expected to compliment the host's wine selection, which tasted like vinegar aged in a shoebox, and nod enthusiastically at some cousin's harpsichord solo. You're also definitely not supposed to yawn, even if it's nearly 2 a.m. Some evenings concluded with what they called the petit coucher, or little sleep, meaning everyone watched the king get ready for bed. Yes, that was entertainment. Imagine gathering your friends to politely observe you remove a wig, sip warm milk, and climb into bed like a god. In fact, entire hierarchies of nobles existed just to hand the king his nightshirt. Historians still argue whether this ritual promoted loyalty or was just a very elaborate joke that got out of hand. Meanwhile, in Edo, Japan, nobles didn't exactly throw after parties, but there was a strict post-dining routine. Guests were expected to compose short poems reflecting on the meal. Not Yelp reviews actual poetry. Something like miso lingers soft. Candle shadows bend and stretch. Autumn tastes like peace. You don't get dessert seconds, but you do get the existential satisfaction of comparing your daikon to a crescent moon. Lucky you. Conversation was hushed, measured. Silence wasn't awkward, it was revered. Slurping your soup was okay. Slurping your opinions, less so. A perfectly timed bow meant more than a clever joke. And if you happened to fall asleep sitting up while a court musician played the koto bonus points for serenity, unless you snore, then exile. In both cultures, digestion wasn't about biology, it was about diplomacy. You didn't burp unless you were French and aristocratic, enough to make it sound intentional. You didn't loosen your belt because corsets and obi sashes are not negotiable. You floated politely, letting the weight of duck liver and fermented turnip rest gently on your soul. Sleep was never guaranteed. Reflux, however, was eternal. Back in Versailles, as candles gutter out and powdered wigs slump sideways, a valet brings your slippers. They're somehow colder than the stone floor. You whisper pleasantries through wine-stained teeth and make your way back to your chamber, dodging gossip like it's a contact sport. Your stomach is full of salted oysters and social anxiety. Congratulations, you survived the meal. Barely. And in Edo, the moon rises over paper screens. A servant gently removes your tray. A single bell chimes in the distance. You whisper a haiku into the dark. Steamed rice fades from tongue. Pine smoke weaves through midnight dreams. Was that eel or carp? You wake up groggy, still digesting 7 kinds of overcooked fowl and fermented side dishes, only to realize you're expected to do it all again today, but differently. Morning afters in both Versailles and Edo, Japan, aren't about recovery. They're about spectacle. Meals didn't start when you were hungry. They started when the right person sat down, which could take hours. Welcome to breakfast, the performance edition at Versailles. The petit déjeuner wasn't breakfast so much as bread theater. You, a minor noble hoping for royal attention, begin your day by staging a careful encounter with hot chocolate so thick it could be legally classified as frosting. But only the right people could sip it. You might get stale bread. If you're lucky, and if you butter it wrong, you're not just uncouth. You're basically a criminal. Nobles would observe who got to eat with the king, who just stood nearby, and who was mysteriously not invited due to yesterday's almond tart incident. And that king, he might rise late, hold a few courtly discussions while lounging in bed, and then eat his own light breakfast at noon, 3 courses deep. One chronicler claimed the Sun King ate broth with fingers because it was more natural. Historians still argue whether this was a display of authenticity or just indigestion from last night's lobster pie. Meanwhile, in Edo, Japan, mornings were quiet, ritualized, and decidedly less greasy. The noble breakfast was a refined balance of rice, miso soup, pickled plum, and grilled fish laid out on lacquerware that cost more than your entire wardrobe. Eating wasn't rushed. Each bite required consideration, almost meditation. Chopsticks must not clatter. Fish must be flipped only with chopsticks, and never skewered. Break that rule. And congratulations, you've committed social seppuku. But it's not all tranquility. Edo elites sometimes held Asakai exclusive breakfast poetry salons. Yes, at dawn, instead of reaching for coffee, you're asked to recite a verse comparing your daikon pickle to a wistful childhood memory. You'd be sleepy, but too terrified to embarrass yourself in front of a retired court official who once wrote a haiku about eel bones. In both cultures, the breakfast table was a trapdoor. Versailles nobles used it to jockey for power one smile to the wrong duchess. And you might find yourself eating with the stable boys tomorrow in Edo. Nobles preserved harmony with stiff politeness, but behind that bowing mask, entire family fortunes were staked on which relative arranged the most poetic bento box. And let's not forget the tableware. In Versailles, golden cutlery had to match the occasion. Using the wrong spoon for soft cheese, scandalous. In Edo, Japan, it wasn't gold, but the lacquerware could flake if mishandled, revealing the dishonor of poor craftsmanship, basically. The chopstick version of wearing socks with sandals. So, you chew, cautiously, symbolically. Every bite is a political decision dressed as breakfast. You're not just hungry, you're under surveillance. Nobles from both East and West have turned the morning meal into an audition for survival. You think lunch might be your salvation. After all, how complicated could a midday meal really be? But as you shuffle back toward another gilded dining chamber, or slide into yet another tatami mat room, the truth dawns: the nobles have saved their strangest habits for last. Lunch was never just about food. It was the art of not eating too much while appearing more elegant than everyone else at the table. Cut a roast in Versailles. Lunch or déjeuner was where performance peaked. Picture this. You're seated near the Duke of So-and-so, desperately trying to cut a roast quail with grace, while an orchestra performs a minuet in the background. But you can't focus, because you've been assigned the chair facing a mirror, and now you're forced to watch yourself eat a form of aristocratic psychological torture. You wonder, is this where self-consciousness was invented? And then, dessert arrives. Not a single cake, not even a row of tarts. No. An entire edible garden shows up sugar sculptures of mythical beasts, spun sugar trees, candied fruits filled with yet more candied fruits. It's like a dentist's fever dream. Historians still argue whether the infamous peacock pie feathers and all was ever truly served, or merely imagined by a sugar-addled courtier, too afraid to ask for bread. Meanwhile, in Edo, Japan, lunch was quieter, but not less strange. You're seated across from an official in full kimono, nervously calculating the exact moment to begin eating. Too early, and you're greedy. Too late, and you're being passive-aggressive. The food itself is precise rice balls that must not fall apart, pickled vegetables arranged to symbolize harmony, soup that must be slurped exactly right. And if you're a woman, you eat facing slightly away because chewing directly at someone is, apparently, emotional violence. By this point, You've likely developed table anxiety, but there's still tea. Versailles nobles took afternoon refreshment with such earnest drama that tea became less about flavor and more about scandal. You sip from porcelain thinner than your patience, praying it doesn't crack under your trembling fingers. Every pause is a chance to insult someone. Every refill signals a political alliance. One wrong gesture, and you're branded vulgar, which is just a courtier's way of saying replaceable. In Edo, the tea ceremony offered a different stress, entirely spiritual perfection. You kneel for 45 minutes while your host silently prepares matcha using centuries-old techniques. There's only one bowl. You all share it. You pretend not to notice the lip print. If you spill a drop, the room goes quiet. One historian notes that tea ceremonies were designed to reveal a person's inner grace. Another suspects they were just elaborate ways to see who had weak knees. And then it ends. Finally, you've survived a full day of noble dining rituals across two empires, separated by continents, but united in one thing, making food awkward. Whether it's a gold-plated fork, a tofu cube arranged like a poem, or a spoon that weighs more than your dignity, you've learned this much. Nobility isn't about what you eat, it's how nervously you do it. And just when you think you can rest, someone announces dinner is in 3 hours. Now, let the image drift from your mind. The lacquered trays, the whispering silks, the dizzying golden hallways, they all blur into the quiet hum of bedtime stillness. You've journeyed through a world where a fork could ruin your reputation and a misplaced chopstick might end your marriage. But it's over now. You're back in your own room, far from powdered wigs and steaming rice. Let the soft tick of modern life soothe you. No one's watching how you chew. No one's judging your spoon. Your mattress is soft. Your clothes aren't ceremonial. And your tea, if you've got any left, is yours alone to finish. Close your eyes. Sink into the comfort of knowing dinner tomorrow will not include a peacock or a haiku. The only ritual now is sleep. Now, we settle into the suffocating silence of a wartime barracks floodlights humming overhead, boots crunching gravel, and an air so sterile you can smell the despair clinging to the concrete. A woman, shaved head and sunken cheeks, meets the eyes of a man in black SS uniform. You would never think that romance could bloom in Auschwitz. But here, in the most absurd theater of cruelty, history hands you a love story no greeting card would dare print. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to comment your location and the local time where you're listening from. Now, back to this deeply questionable relationship. He was Franz Wunsch, a young SS guard known to serenade from the camp loudspeakers, and she was Helena Citronova, a Slovakian Jewish prisoner. He saw her during a forced labor shift, sweaty, starving, and operating a machine press. Naturally, the most obvious romantic lead, he sends her secret notes, contraband sugar, and compliments that are, at best, wildly inappropriate for a genocide setting. You might think this is a story of rescue. Helena's life was spared during multiple roll calls. Wunsch even risked punishment to keep her and her sister from the gas chambers. He pulled strings, lied to officers, and forged paperwork, all very Prince Charming, except instead of a glass slipper, it's forged medical records and casual war crimes. The question one historians still argue over is, did she love him back? Helena herself later testified, that she was terrified, confused, and felt compelled to accept his affections. After all, he held the power of life and death. This wasn't a rom-com. It was survival dressed as sentiment. Years later, Helena was called to testify at Wunsch's trial. And here's your big cinematic twist: she defended him, claimed he saved lives, described his actions without venom. Whether that was compassion, guilt, or Stockholm Syndrome, no one knows. Even now, scholars go back and forth. Was this a real emotional connection, or a trauma-fueled coping mechanism? The fringe detail that keeps history professors up at night. Franz Wunsch apparently kept Helena's photo long after the war, a creased, faded picture of the woman he loved, while orchestrating mass death all around her. That is a romantic gesture that even your most toxic ex probably wouldn't attempt. This isn't your average wartime fling. This is a psychological puzzle wrapped in a nightmare. You're left lying in your bunk, wondering, can love exist in a place built for annihilation? Or is this just a particularly manipulative form of possession, disguised with stolen perfume and smuggled bread? Either way, the violin music never plays in Auschwitz. Just the guard's boots and the sound of someone trying, quietly, not to die. You're strolling through occupied Paris, not for pleasure, but because curfew hasn't hit yet, and your lipstick might be hiding secrets. A German officer tips his cap, and you force a smile, not out of love, but out of calculus. That's what war does, turns dates into dossiers, and flirtation into survival. And that's how you end up in a cafe, drinking terrible ersatz coffee across from someone who might get you arrested or save your family. This is the uncomfortable world of the collabo horizontale, the horizontal collaborators, as the French mockingly called them. Women who consorted with German occupiers during World War II were seen as traitors not for passing secrets, but for passing time in bed. After liberation, these women were punished in one of the more publicly medieval ways imaginable: heads shaved, clothes torn, paraded through the streets while onlookers shouted and spat. You'd think they just invaded France themselves, but here's the real twist. Some of them weren't traitors at all. Some were spies. French intelligence occasionally encouraged these relationships, and others were just teenagers trying to feed their families. Your lover brings canned meat and cigarettes. You bring plausible deniability. Historians still debate how many of these relationships were truly consensual. Some argue it was survival, pure and simple. Others point out that many of these women returned to the same lovers after the war, suggesting that feelings, however tangled, had roots deeper than rations. And still others insist it was all coercion and power imbalance dressed up in perfume. One fringe case that reads like a noir film, Coco Chanel. Yes, that Chanel. She reportedly took a German lover, and some claim she tried to broker peace between the Nazis and Winston Churchill. Whether she was a collaborator or just really bad at choosing boyfriends remains up for scholarly dissection. The woman could reinvent the little black dress, but apparently not her dating profile. Meanwhile, the men rarely punished. French men who fraternized with female German informants were often seen as victims or simply overlooked. But women, their betrayal was shaved into their scalps and screamed from rooftops. Still, amid all the shame, some couples stayed together. You'll find rare stories of a French woman and her former German lover relocating, marrying, even living quietly into old age. No one wants to talk about them at family dinners. That lipstick, by the way, probably made with beetroot and despair. But it still gets you noticed. And that Nazi officer watching you from across the cafe, he could be your next source of intel. Or your next regret. The moral clarity of romance doesn't stand a chance in wartime Paris. Here, love speaks German, carries a Luger, and wears polished boots. So you adjust your skirt, sip your weak coffee, and try to remember which lies you told yesterday, because in this war, the most dangerous thing isn't betrayal, it's being believed. You wake up on a foggy English morning to the sound of chickens, wind, and a distinctly non-British voice trying to coax a tractor into motion. Welcome to rural Britain, 1943, where Italian prisoners of war are everywhere, and not just in the fields. They're also in the hearts and sometimes barns of local girls, including, possibly, yours. You trudge out with a basket of eggs and find him kneeling in the mud, fixing a fence post with the kind of quiet resolve usually reserved for romantic leads in wartime paperbacks. He grins, you look away, because you're patriotic, and also 17, and maybe your dad is watching. After Italy switched sides in 1943, thousands of Italian POWs were released to work on British farms under guard, or sometimes just under suspicion. They planted potatoes, mended roofs, and in some cases, swept young women off their ration-starved feet. The British government tried to discourage fraternization, then promptly ignored it when it became obvious that pigs weren't going to feed themselves. Mainstream historians agree that many of these relationships were consensual, even affectionate. Some ended in marriage, others in heartbreak, when the Italian men were shipped back home to villages that didn't quite have room for unexpected half-British toddlers. One fringe story involves a POW named Luigi, who built a chapel. Yes, a whole chapel on Orkney Island using concrete and bits of scrap metal. It still stands today, a poetic testament to hope, faith, and possibly a crush on the woman who brought him tea every afternoon. The debate, though, is whether these romances were truly mutual. Historians still argue if power imbalance played a role. After all, a man with no rights, no passport, and no options may seem charming because he has literally nowhere else to go. Like a golden retriever, but with a better mustache. And let's not forget the local tension. Villagers weren't always thrilled to see their daughters strolling through fields with men who had been, technically, enemy combatants 5 months earlier. Nothing says awkward like family dinner with the guy who used to shout Mussolini in battle. Still, in many cases, these relationships blossomed into quiet, long-term partnerships. A few Italian-British marriages even became part of local folklore. Imagine telling your grandchildren that you met during a war, in a potato field, with barbed wire between you and the turnips. You can picture it now. Stolen glances over cabbage patches, love notes smuggled in bread loaves, and courtship conversations that begin with, "Do you understand sheep shears?" and end with, "Marry me." Because in a world torn apart by bombs and nationalism, sometimes the most rebellious thing you can do is fall in love with someone who is supposed to be your enemy, even if he does smell vaguely of garlic and manure. You're standing in a sun-scorched Crusader outpost, somewhere between Jerusalem and poor decision-making. Your armor smells like regret, and the last drinkable water you had was 2 days ago served in a skull. Probably. You glance across the market and see her dark eyes, linen scarf, selling figs. Your sword says infidel, Your heart says maybe just one date. The Crusades weren't known for their romantic subplots, but human nature has a way of complicating even the most aggressive holy war. Knights were supposed to fight, convert, or kill, not flirt. But flirt they did. Interfaith relationships during the Crusades did exist, despite everything from language barriers to genocidal expectations. It's like Romeo and Juliet. If the Montagues burned down Capulet villages as a hobby, you meet her under a crumbling archway. She sells you dates. You mispronounce her name 6 times. It's less of a Hallmark moment, more of a war crimes mixtape, with a love track awkwardly wedged in. Some records tell of Frankish knights taking local Muslim or Christian women as concubines, wives, or something in between. The definition of romance here stretches thinner than your dried rations. Still, there are stories rare but persistent of knights who converted for love, or who refused to leave when their armies packed up and sailed home. Some even adopted local customs, dressed like locals, and raised bicultural children. Whether they were enlightened or just bad at following orders is still up for debate. Historians continue to argue whether these stories reflect genuine connection or simply strategic survival. Was it love, lust, or land rights? The lines blur faster than ink on a crusader's diary page. Then there's the oddball tale of Robert of St. Albans, an English Templar who converted to Islam, married a relative of Saladin, and fought against his former comrades. That's either the most dramatic breakup in medieval Europe or a very enthusiastic career pivot. It still baffles scholars. Was he radicalized by romance or just tired of chainmail? Cultural mixing was happening on every level: music, architecture, even hygiene. You finally learn about baths. And yet, these relationships rarely got the fairy tale ending. Marrying outside your faith and culture was risky. You could be accused of betrayal, heresy, or just having incredibly poor taste. One fringe discovery: Crusader cemeteries sometimes contain individuals buried with items from both Christian and Islamic traditions. Whether that signals interfaith unions or just really bad burial planning, no one knows. So you walk through the narrow alleys of Jerusalem, past spice carts and judgmental monks. You steal one more glance at the fig seller. She smiles. You do not smile back. Your helmet won't let you, but you nod, ever so slightly. It is, after all, the 12th century's version of Text Me Later, because even when drenched in blood and ideology, the heart occasionally lobs a grenade of its own. You're sitting in a smoky East Berlin cafe that smells like boiled cabbage, coffee, and Cold War paranoia. Across from you is Anya, or whatever her name really is. She has perfect posture, suspiciously clean shoes, and asks oddly specific questions about your work and paper distribution. You laugh, sip your drink, and pretend you're not about to be betrayed for the 5th time this week. Welcome to the era of espionage, where romance was both weapon and weakness. You thought you were falling in love. Turns out, you were just falling into a well-planned KGB asset trap. Again, the line between intimacy and intel was never thinner than in Cold War Berlin. Everyone had secrets. Some wore them like perfume. Others handed them over with a kiss. CIA field officers routinely warned recruits that relationships could compromise missions, but warnings rarely held up against long legs and longer nights. You walk home with her through the fog. She hums a Russian lullaby. You try not to picture the listening devices probably sewn into her coat lining. There are true stories, many declassified, of spies who married their targets. Some were sincere, others were long con operations that would make even reality TV producers blush. Historians still argue whether agents like Marcus Wolf's Romeo spies truly fell for their assignments or simply played the part too well. When your job is to seduce enemy clerks and extract NATO secrets, emotional confusion is, frankly, part of the onboarding process. The Romeo program targeted lonely West German women working in government offices. These spies didn't break in through skylights. They sent flowers. They didn't use cyanide usually, just charm, forged credentials, and the occasional tragic backstory about a sick grandmother. One fringe tale involves a secretary who remained loyal to her husband for decades, not realizing he was a Stasi agent until he ghosted her via permanent defection. Imagine waiting for a postcard and getting a file from counterintelligence instead. The open scholarly debate centers on what happened when the lies turned real. Some agents genuinely fell in love with their targets, confessed, defected, or simply disappeared. Can two people build a real relationship on a foundation of fake names, fake careers, and very real betrayal? Unclear. But it makes for excellent pillow talk. The coffee's gone cold. So is your hand in hers. You both pretend not to notice the unmarked car parked across the street. Romance here isn't just dangerous, it's classified. You say goodnight. She doesn't follow. Maybe she's going home. Maybe she's going to report you. Maybe both. But as you watch her disappear into the gray, you wonder if love is the battlefield. Maybe espionage is just extreme dating. Either way, you never see her again. But you do see your phone line's been tapped. You wake to the smell of iodine, bandages, and the unmistakable stench of a Crimean War hospital tent, which is to say, you wake to misery. A nurse leans over you with a wet cloth and a voice like soft thunder. She's not Florence Nightingale, but she's memorized your pulse, your fever spikes, and your favorite swear words. You've lost a foot, 3 friends, and half your will to live. But you gain something else, stolen glances and quiet touches that shouldn't be allowed within 6 feet of cholera. Welcome to love in the field hospital, where clean sheets are theoretical, privacy is non-existent, and courtship is measured in morphine doses. The image of Florence Nightingale, the lady with the lamp, is iconic. But behind that glow were dozens of real nurses who formed intimate bonds with patients, sometimes brief, sometimes lifelong, sometimes mildly scandalous. Mainstream history likes to keep things respectable, but dig a little deeper, and the wartime wards start looking less like sanctuaries and more like speed dating arenas with higher stakes. Imagine being cleaned and dressed daily by someone who isn't technically allowed to touch you affectionately, but whose every movement saves your life. That kind of dependence grows roots, fast. In moments between amputations and epidemics, letters were exchanged, promises whispered. Some nurses went on to marry their patients. Others simply returned home with carefully hidden stories and love tokens stuffed into their medical kits. One fringe detail, Victorian love tokens often included hair, like actual, snipped from the scalp hair. You're dying in a trench, and your final gift is part of your scalp in an envelope. Nothing says romance like follicular memorabilia, but historians still argue just how common these nurse-patient relationships were. Some claim they were widespread and quietly tolerated. Others insist they were rare exceptions sensationalized after the fact. It's hard to say diary pages from the time are torn between devotion and discretion. Also, not all relationships were equal. Officers got more attention, more privacy, more chances for emotional attachment. Regular soldiers, they mostly got cold broth and a firm warning to stop bleeding on the sheets. Love, like war, wasn't exactly evenly distributed. And let's not pretend every nurse was a saint. Some were there for money, adventure, or status. Others were barely trained volunteers with more enthusiasm than skill. Still, amid the infection and rot, connections bloomed. You, a barely coherent patient with a bullet near your spine, fall for the woman who calmly extracts it while lecturing you about hydration. The real kicker: some soldiers faked injuries just to get close to the nurses. Stubbed toes, light fevers, and unexplained fainting became oddly common during quiet periods. Anything for a smile, a spoonful of soup, and a few extra minutes near the only clean person within 500 miles. So now you lie here, one leg short and one heart full, staring up at canvas ceilings while she hums a lullaby and pretends not to notice how long she's holding your hand. War makes everything urgent, even love, especially love. You duck into a bakery and hand over your ration ticket. The baguette is warm, crusty, and unusually hollow in the middle. Inside, a tightly folded note written in invisible ink, courtesy of the resistance and possibly your new romantic partner. You didn't mean to fall in love with someone who stores secrets in baked goods, but it's Paris, 1942. If you want romance, you'd better bring your own encryption. Resistance fighters weren't just grizzled saboteurs with dynamite. Many were teenagers, students, librarians, even jazz musicians, people who could pass unnoticed through checkpoints, train stations, and ballroom dances. You're one of them. And the woman who just dropped a lipstick tube full of microfilm into your coat pocket is, allegedly, your girlfriend. You see her in the blur of wartime at secret drop points, in alleys disguised as lovers embracing, at funerals that double as coordination meetings. You never know her full name. She never knows yours. But you remember the curve of her smile when the mission goes right, and the grip of her hand when it goes wrong. Historians still argue whether these love stories were real or simply the byproduct of proximity, adrenaline, and terror. When someone saves your life twice a week, emotional attachment isn't just likely, it's inevitable. But does it count as romance when it's stitched together with panic and phosphorus? One fringe story tells of a Belgian couple who ran a bookstore by day and a printing press for the resistance by night. They printed fake IDs and pamphlets in the basement, raised 3 children upstairs, and casually fell in love somewhere between the ink spills and Gestapo raids. It's like You've Got Mail, except every message could get you executed. But these relationships weren't just sweet. They were strategic liabilities. Love made resistance members vulnerable. It was harder to betray strangers than lovers. Intelligence networks often discouraged deep personal bonds. Some even reassigned couples to separate cells. Because nothing says romantic evening like being accused of compromising operational security over dinner. Still, it happened. You meet her in a rain-soaked alleyway. She passes you a coded message hidden inside a cigarette case and touches your face like it might be the last time. It might be. The physical intimacy was limited. There was simply no time. But the emotional intensity, off the charts. Think wartime Romeo and Juliet, but with less poetry and more minds, sometimes. Relationships outlasted the occupation. Resistance couples married after liberation, finally learning each other's real names at the altar. Others never reunited. Their love left behind on a train platform or in the back of a moving truck. And then there were the betrayals. Double agents, lovers turned informants, people who cracked under torture and gave up everything including you. Resistance. Love stories weren't always inspiring. Sometimes they ended with court-martials and confession notes written in shaking hands. So you sit in a dark apartment, loading a pistol with one hand and clutching a photograph with the other. You don't know where she is tonight, but you do know that if the knock on the door isn't Gestapo, maybe just maybe it's her, with another baguette. You kneel in the tatami-matted silence of a samurai home, surrounded by scrolls, incense, and very pointed expectations. Your husband, if anyone acknowledges him as such, is off to war, leaving you with a bonsai to water and a life to vanish into. You are a samurai wife, or maybe a concubine, or maybe just someone whose name won't appear in the family registry, but who receives love letters written in perfect calligraphy, folded into origami cranes. In feudal Japan, romance was an exercise in constraint. Duty eclipsed desire. Samurai followed Bushido, the way of the warrior, less about candle-lit dinners and more about beheading dissenters with elegance. Love, if it existed, wore armor made of poetry and ambiguity. Your partner may adore you, but legally, you're scenery. Wives were chosen for alliances, concubines for beauty, lovers for the quiet spaces in between. And yet, historians have uncovered private correspondence tender letters, longing haikus, subtle complaints about war and distance, real feelings, scratched into rice paper by men trained to slit throats without blinking. One mainstream example, the letters of date Masamune, a one-eyed warlord with a terrifying reputation and surprisingly gentle words for his wife. His tone shifts between battlefield updates and yearning prose. I dream of your face, he writes. You dream of him not dying. Samurai widows, however, weren't always left with poetry. Sometimes they were left with nothing. If you weren't the official wife, you had no inheritance, no title, and occasionally no home. Some turned to the convent, others to poetry, a few to very sharp knives. The fringe detail, certain samurai women trained in naginata polearm combat to defend the household. One famous case, Nakano Takeko, led a battalion of female warriors during the Boshin War. She also wrote poems between skirmishes, because apparently, in Japan, you could bleed and rhyme at the same time. Historians still debate how widespread women's agency really was in samurai society. Some argue women were silent shadows. Others say they were quietly influential, managing estates and shaping legacies behind folding screens. The truth likely lies somewhere between invisibility and indirect power. You exist just not in the lineage charts, and yet, romance bloomed. The husband returns from war missing a finger, but bearing a gift silk dyed with the color of spring plum blossoms. He says little, but writes a new poem in your journal every morning before dawn. You brew tea. You pretend not to cry. Even arranged marriages sometimes deepened over time. The rhythms of daily life, shared silences, and survival of endless political storms created a strange intimacy. You might not choose him, but you learn him. And when he dies, in battle or worse, commits seppuku, you are expected to mourn with grace. Not too loud, not too long. Just enough to remind society that your love existed, but not enough to imply it mattered more than honor. You press your forehead to the floor, whisper a goodbye, and burn the final letter. In this world, love is folded into ceremony and hidden beneath sleeves. Quiet, enduring, and sharp enough to cut. You stand on a crowded pier in 1946, holding a suitcase that rattles with nervous teacups and reckless hope. Your new husband, American, or Canadian, or maybe just vaguely English-speaking, waves at you from the boat. You barely know him, but you married him during wartime, in a flurry of uniforms, urgency, and blackout curtains. Now you're sailing into the unknown, a freshly minted war bride with nothing but your name, a few photos, and a dress that doesn't quite fit. After World War II, more than 100,000 women left their homelands to follow the men they'd fallen in love with during the chaos. British brides boarded ships to Canada. Japanese women braved bureaucratic suspicion to reach the U.S. Even German and Italian brides, yes, from the wrong side, were eventually allowed to join their spouses. The love was real, or real enough to survive passports and prejudice. You step onto the deck. It's your honeymoon. And immigration paperwork in one. There's no welcome parade, just a seasick neighbor and a child who won't stop crying. Romance becomes a logistical problem very quickly. One mainstream case, the American GI Bride phenomenon. Entire military programs were created to process and transport these women. Operation War Bride was a real thing, complete with trains, translators, and bureaucratic bafflement. Imagine customs officers trying to figure out what a dowry is. Of course, not all stories ended happily. Some war brides were abandoned. Others arrived to find their husbands had lied, or moved on, or simply forgotten how to speak kindly. Historians still debate whether these unions were the product of true love or desperation on both sides. The women left homes, languages, and identities. The men brought home wives with cultures their families didn't always welcome. Fringe detail. In Australia, one war bride faked her own death to escape a particularly disappointing marriage, then successfully remarried Hashi under a new identity. Love is complicated. International love, even more so. Still, some marriages thrived. War had stripped people down to their bones. There was no time for pretense. The bonds formed in those compressed months often ran deep. You knew how he panicked under fire. He knew how you rationed sugar. Romance wasn't roses, it was resilience. As your ship rocks gently across the Atlantic or Pacific, or something in between, you clutch the railing and squint toward a continent you've never set foot on. Your husband is somewhere on the dock, holding flowers, or maybe a map, or maybe nothing at all, because he's late, and you're already wondering if this was a good idea. But the sea is behind you. The war is over. And ahead is a small, unfamiliar apartment filled with mismatched furniture, translation dictionaries, and the long, slow unfolding of ordinary life. And now, as we drift into sleep, the boats fade into mist. The whispered promises of lovers in every war-torn century blur into silence. You rest your head against a velvet dream, surrounded by letters never sent, photos never taken, and the echo of footsteps crossing oceans. It's over now. You're safe. Sleep well.